Good morning, everyone. I am Derek Graham, State Representative from Franklin County and the House Democratic floor leader. I want to greet all of you on behalf of the people of Franklin County, and I hope you enjoy today's program. This will be an exciting program, and thank you all for being here. The Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus has hosted Black History celebrations for over a decade in the rotunda of the Kentucky State Capitol. It has been our pleasure to bring representatives of the three branches of government and invited guests from all over the Commonwealth to its symbolic center to acknowledge the challenges and accomplishments of African Americans with ties to Kentucky and beyond. Now, the KBLC has extended its reach in offering a platform for expression and discourse as we continue on this journey of greater understanding and confirmation. Thus, the KBLC Speaker Series is born. And welcome to this second of the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus inaugural Speaker Series in collaboration with the Kentucky Historical Society and the African American Initiative. Thank you all for being here, and God bless you. And now I turn it over to my colleague, Senator. Okay, all right, okay, come on, sorry.
Thank you, Representative Graham. I'm also serving as technology person, so forgive me if we're jumping back and forth. Gerald, I think we're good to go. I'm hoping. Well, first of all, before I wanted to welcome everybody that was here today. I wanted to give you a little perspective on, but first of all, I'm Scott Alvey. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Historical Society. And our KHS mission is to educate and engage the public through Kentucky history in order to meet the challenges of the future. To educate and engage the public through Kentucky history. One of our greatest challenges is combating that perception that history is finite, that it's complete, that it never changes. That it's just merely facts and information that we sit there and study and look at and recite every once in a while. But given time, we gain more perspective, and it gives us the opportunity to challenge those past interpretations and relook at new ones, which I think is very exciting for our speakers and our panelists today to be able to look at what our history is telling us now. On February 7th, I went up to the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus event up in the Rotunda, and the theme of Black history is American history resonated a lot. It's also Kentucky history. So I think it's very fitting that we are in this room today. This is a room where decisions were made that impacted our future. It's a room to where those decisions can now be analyzed. Was the intended impact what actually happened? Or are there changes that we need to think about and look at? So how does history help inform that analysis of those changes? When I got Senator Neal's call right after the event saying, Scott, we need to have this at the Kentucky Historical Society. And I totally agreed. I came back from the event and told my team that we need to work with Senator Neal and the Black Caucus to figure out how to have this event here even next year. I didn't imagine that we'd be able to pull it off and have you all here today. The Kentucky Historical Society is honored to host this event. And I want to welcome our friends and colleagues, both here in person and joining us on our live stream today. So welcome to the Kentucky Historical Society. Thank you for being here.
Hello, my name is Alan Benson, and I bring you greetings from the African American Initiative. The African American Initiative is a wide array of primarily African American stakeholders, leaders, and operatives that come together to address the issues that confront the African American community. It features policies and issues-driven discussions to promote a greater understanding of what produces outcomes that we witness today. AAI recognizes that it is through these insights that we can better inspire and plan actions that are productive for the future. The African American Initiative is honored to be a part of this inaugural Black History Speakers event. As we celebrate Black History Month, We have to recognize that many African Americans have made great sacrifices of blood, sweat, and tears to push open the doors we all are walking through. And as we congregate today, it is my hope that we continue to push through those doors even wider so that all children have a brighter tomorrow. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Gerald Neal. I represent the 33rd Senatorial District in Louisville. And I was just thinking to myself that the Black History Month celebration, in extending this to a speaker series, was historical in itself. But then being in this building and doing it from here is historical in itself. Then I thought about the collaboration between the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus, the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation, as well as the African American Initiative. This is a first on all fronts. I want to acknowledge George Brown, who is the chairman of the Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus, who provides the leadership, direction, and coordination of our organization. If you give him a round of applause, please. The Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus is delighted to present the second of our speaker series. We will begin with a presentation by Dr. Gerald L. Smith, author and professor of history at the University of Kentucky. Following the presentation by Dr. Smith, we will thereafter join a panel of distinguished scholars, including Ladetta Denise Grimes, oral historian, Clemson University, Ricky L. Jones, Director of Pan-African Studies, University of Louisville, Takia Anthony, Associate Professor of History, Interim Dean, Whitney Young Honors Colloquium in Kentucky State University. Dr. Gerald L. Smith is a native of Lexington. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Kentucky in history. He taught at the University of Memphis from 1988 to 1993. He is a full professor of history and a former holder of both the Theodore Howland Professorship and the Martin Luther King Center Scholar in Residence at the University of Kentucky. From 1997 to 2005, he serves as the director of the African American Studies and Research Program at University of Kentucky. He is a former pastor of the Ferristown Baptist Church in Berea, Kentucky. Since 2011, he has served as pastor of the Pilgrim Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Dr. Smith is the author, editor, and co-editor of 5 books. His most recent is an edited collection of path-breaking essays entitled Slavery and Freedom in the Bluegrass State, Revisiting My Old Kentucky Home. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Gerald Smith.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Senator Neal for the introduction and the honor and privilege of serving as the inaugural, or rather yet one of the inaugural speakers for this series. You know, when you begin these kind of programs, it always starts a little slow. Audience is always small, but I know it will grow in time. And so we are looking forward to the next 5 years when this place will be packed out. Now, if I was in the church, I would say, somebody else say amen. All right. But Senator Neal said you're not in church, so don't even worry about it, son. I ain't going to preach either. All right. So here we go. You know, I'm going to frame my comments. I thought about the panel and just how we might move forward with the discussion. And so I put together some notes, you know, last night and PowerPoint. And so I'm going to talk about researching, writing, and teaching African American history. And I'll speak for probably about 16, 17 minutes. John Ersk's 2004 book titled Liberation Historiography, African American Writers and the Challenge of History, 1794 to 1861, is a history of black people writing about black history. His book reveals that black people have been researching and writing about black history since the late 18th century. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, Robert Benjamin Lewis, Henry Garnett, J.W.C. Pennington, as well as William Wells Brown, who was born in Kentucky, were all writing and publishing works on the black experience in America as well as Africa. Ernest, an English professor, notes that, quote, in all forms and forums of historical writing, African Americans necessarily had to contend with and against the developing tradition of white American historical thought, as well as the pointed erasure of Africa as a site of history and Enlightenment thought, end quote. He goes on to write, quote, the African American historian was left to create a community from the scattered remnants of a largely unknowable past, end quote. After the Civil War, African Americans continued to research and write about their past. George Washington Williams, who was pictured here, was a Civil War veteran and one who would write a 2-volume history on African Americans in 1882. You'll see pictured there Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who achieved the distinction of being the father of African American history, who was born in Virginia, would earn a Bachelor of Literature degree from Berea College in 1903 and later a PhD from Harvard in 1915. Besides founding the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, he established the Association Publishers to publish books on blacks beginning in 1920. Long before the debates over critical race theory, the 1619 Project, the curricula of AP African American history courses, and the culture of wokeism, Woodson penned what is arguably his most prophetic work titled The Miseducation of the Negro in 1933, where he posited, quote, the so-called modern education with all its defects, however, does others so much more than good than it does the Negro, because it has been worked out in conformity to the needs of those who have enslaved and oppressed weaker peoples. Woodson went on to write the famous lines, when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. He went on to say that you don't have to tell him not to stand or where to go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You don't need to send him to the back door. He'll go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he'll cut one for this special benefit. His education makes it necessary. The same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of genius in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other people. The Negro, thus educated, writes Woodson, is a hopeless liability of the race. 2 years later, in 1935, Dr. W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to receive a PhD degree from Harvard, offered his own perspective on the research, writing, and teaching of history. In his 1935 monumental work titled Black Reconstruction, Du Bois closes this more than 700-page book with a biting chapter titled The Propaganda of History. Now, as many of you already know, following the Civil War, America, both in the North and the South, went through a period of crisis and change and controversy as the South sought to rebuild its economy and infrastructure, reclaim its heritage, and restore control over the lives of more than 4 million newly freed black people. Meanwhile, these freed men and women built their own schools and churches and businesses, founded organizations and communities, as many others of them struggled, sacrificed, and died in making the transition from enslavement to freedom. Du Bois began that closing chapter of his book, The Propaganda of History, by examining the results of recent studies of 1935 textbooks. The study revealed that black and white students were taught 3 overall lessons regarding Reconstruction. 1, that all Negroes were ignorant. 2, that all Negroes were lazy and dishonest and extravagant. And thirdly, quote, the Negroes were responsible for bad government during Reconstruction. In combating these conclusions, Du Bois responded by writing, quote, war and especially civil strife leave terrible wounds. It is the duty of humanity to heal them. We have too often a deliberate attempt to change the facts of history that the story will make pleasant reading for Americans. Du Bois went on to write, quote, "If history is going to be scientific, if the record of human action is going to be set down with the accuracy and faithfulness of detail, which will allow its use as a measuring rod and a guidepost for the future of the nations, there must be a set of some standards of ethics in research and interpretations. If, on the other hand, we're going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history, either as a science or as an art, using the results of science, and admit frankly that we are using a version of historic fact in order to influence and educate the new generation along the way that we wish." Continued Du Bois, "It is propaganda like this that has led men in the past to insist that history is, quote, lies agreed upon, and to point out the danger in such misinformation." As of 1933, Black history courses were being taught in nearly 50 of the 174 segregated high schools in the South. Most Black schools in Mississippi offered the subject as an elective. Interestingly, white administrative school officials did not question Woodson's book or Du Bois's book on the teaching, researching, and writing of Black history. After all, white students would not be enrolled in the course anyway. Much of the opposition to teaching Black history actually came from Black school teachers themselves, who concerned that examples of racial progress might simply be inspiring students to reach goals that were unattainable, considering the hostile and oppressive racial climate during the period of segregation. And of course, it is during this period when we will see our society saturated with images, derogatory images of Black people. Those last two photographs were Kentucky. One was a postcard in Bowling Green of a Black chain gang. This image right here, we published in the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia, is a watermelon contest in Louisville in the 1940s. In the 1930s, Alice Dunnigan was teaching a course on Kentucky history in Logan County and discovered that none of the textbooks referenced the contributions of Black people. Before becoming the first African American to hold the title White House correspondent, she prepared a, quote, daily fact sheet, end quote, on the role of Blacks in Kentucky history. Her efforts caught the attention of William Farris, who wrote an essay in the National Review commending her efforts and suggesting that she publish a book. He said, and I quote, "It will render a twofold service. It will inform the Negro that, handicapped as he has been since the emancipation from bondage, he has done something else besides sing and dance, fight, shoot craps, and drink whiskey. It will show that he has not only made cultural advances, but has also built up a few businesses, enterprises, which have been able to withstand the shock of the Depression. It will give the Negro child information which will inspire him. In other words, it will banish the inferiority complex, which is a weight around the Black man's neck, dragging him down and back," end quote. In 1971, the book Kentucky Black Heritage was published by the Kentucky Black History Committee of the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights. The publication came about because of House Resolution 59, which was passed in 1970. According to the book's introduction, the book had two purposes. First, to give young Black students knowledge of the role Black people played in the state in the development of Kentucky, so that they may possess a sense of pride in their heritage. And second, to give young white students an accurate understanding of the problems faced by Blacks and the creative role Black people have played in the state's history. The introduction further noted that, quote, if history is taught so that students will understand the present through the knowledge of past events, then this purpose can be realized only if textbooks and classroom presentations accurately describe the events and conditions of the past. The introduction of the book went on to say to omit or misrepresent certain aspects of history, such as cultural pluralism, the role of black people, quote, will result in a distorted picture of both the past and the present, end quote. Researching, teaching, and writing about the general history of Kentucky has always been a challenge. State historian Dr. James Clotter wrote in a 1982 article that, quote, over the years, Kentuckians have provided themselves a history-minded people, both aware and proud of their past, end quote. But Clotter concluded that the state paled by comparison to the level of scholarship produced by other states. As histories of other states expanded in volumes written, historical record-keeping, analysis, and publication, Kentucky historiography lagged behind. Courthouse fires, the failure to retain records, and the belated effort to collect primary sources had created a great challenge for those wanting to write about Kentucky. Documenting and teaching Kentucky's black history has been an even greater challenge. First, there has been the declining percentage of blacks who have lived in the state because of the attraction of northern industrial jobs, educational opportunities, and momentous changes in working conditions. All this led to an out-migration of Kentucky's black citizens. A second challenge has been the worn-out myth that races in Kentucky have lived together in peace. This belief was strongly tied to a popular and historiographical tradition that was best expressed by historian and photographer J. Winston Coleman, who wrote in his 1940 book, Slavery Times in Kentucky, quote, generally speaking, the slaves were a happy, contented, and carefree race, well-fed as their looks testified, well-lodged and not overworked, end quote. White Kentucky educators, politicians, and writers sought to portray an image of race relations that was not hostile and unequal. The notion that there was a mutual respect and appreciation shared between the races continued to perpetuate an image of race history in Kentucky that would last well into even the 21st century. For example, prize-winning journalist and Glasgow native Arthur Crock concluded that whites appreciated the input of their workers. He wrote, the Negroes served, yes, but also they were called into confidence on equal terms on matters affecting the household, agriculture, and the security of the community from racial violence. For at least in our community, the responsible Negroes possessed an exceptional measure, the instinct for wise solutions to such problems, end quote. Kentucky novelist John Fox Jr., in writing the introduction to his sister Minnie Fox's 1904 cookbook, expressed his admiration for Kentucky's black cooks. Quote, she came to the bluegrass from Virginia more than 100 years ago, swift on the flying feet of the Indian. She was broad, portly, kind of heart, though severe of countenance as befitting her dignity, and usually of quick temper and of sharp tongue. As far as I know, she never got her just due. In 1950, Survey magazine reported that, quote, as a border state, Kentucky's allegiance to segregation was not firmly rooted in the Deep South. Moreover, it has a large number of northern-born citizens. Newspapers, particularly the liberal-minded Courier Journal and Louisville Times, have supported the Negroes' fight for economic and education rights. During the early years of school desegregation, the Courier Journal claimed that, quote, Kentucky does not have a history of racial conflict and tension to be compared with that of states of the old Confederacy. All of this tended to ease the way for compliance in Kentucky. In short, black history in Kentucky appeared relatively uneventful. However, in recent years, there has been an emphasis on focusing more on including the African American experience in the nation's experience as well as in Kentucky's experience. For a number of years, the racial lines of segregation, education, and housing had been erased and ignored, along with the extent of racial violence in the state. But by the end of the 20th century, scholars began offering a more balanced and inclusive interpretation of what was happening in some African American communities over the past 100 years. And so there's been a growing interest in social and cultural history, along with the desegregation of academic institutions and public libraries, that now scholars are more excited to research and write and even teach about the African American experience in the state. There's a wealth of primary sources now, and many of those primary sources can be found at the Kentucky Historical Society, including oral history collections of African Americans that are housed in institutions around the state of Kentucky. Their primary sources, the NAACP papers, the core papers, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, among others, illuminate events taking shape in the lives of African Americans. Working with court records and manuscript collections offer a rich detail along with newspapers in terms of exactly what was happening in the state. Comparative studies on topics between states and regions are now a part of the change that we see in the teaching, researching, and writing of the African American experience. In his book, Essaying the Past, How to Read, Write, and Think About History, Jim Cullen distinguishes the difference between reading history and writing history. He said, quote, "It's like the difference between watching a ball game from the stands and actually playing in the field. The former has its pleasures, for sure, but the latter is literally where the action is, even if you're not a pro. It's important that we continue mining available sources in hopes of uncovering new material that will facilitate our understanding of the African American experience in general." It's kind of a little self-promotion with several of my books, if you've ever noticed. And then I close with my own latest publication, Slavery and Freedom in the Bluegrass State, Revisiting My Old Kentucky Home. It's important, of course, that we continue mining these sources, and as a closing word, as historian Thomas C. Holt has so persuasively noted, quote, "We can write no genuine history of the Black experience without attempting to see our ancestors face to face, without straining to hear their thoughts and desires, without groping for the textures of their interior worlds," end quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for that insightful presentation. I have to say that I think you framed it very well for the discussion here today. At this time, I'd like to introduce the balance of our panel. With us to the left of Dr. Smith is Dr. Ricky L. Jones. He's professor and chair of the University of Louisville's Department of Pan-African Studies. A native of Atlanta, Georgia, Jones was educated as an undergraduate at the U.S. Naval Academy and Morehouse College. He was only the second African American to receive a PhD in political science from the University of Kentucky.
Hey, Gerald, you mentioned he was on my committee.
Is that right? Thank you for the embellishment there. where he specialized in political philosophy and comparative politics. His books include 2 editions of Black Haze, Balance, Sacrifice, and Manhood in Black Greek Letter Fraternities, and What's Wrong with Obama Mania? Black America, Black Leadership, and the Death of Political Imagination. He's currently co-authoring a new book with attorney and award-winning cartoonist Mark Murphy, entitled Colin, Confederates, and Con Artists, Essays on American Passions, Problems, and Possibilities. That philosophical piece is coming through, I think. Yeah. To his left is Dr. Lidetta Denise Grimes is an oral historian at Clemson University, is a trained historian, educator, and journalist. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Kentucky, and her research focus is black communities in the 19th and 20th centuries. Black agency, agenda, and activism are key themes in her work. And she studies a distinct group of schools now known as Rosenwald schools. And to her left is Dr. Takia N. Anthony. Dr. Anthony is the interim dean of the Whitney Young Honors Collegium and Graduate Studies and the Academic Support Liaison for the Center of Excellence for the Study of Kentucky African Americans at Kentucky State University. As an associate professor of history, Dr. Anthony's area of expertise are the African diaspora and archiving. She has lectured and spoken on panels throughout the United States, South Korea, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and it goes on and on and on, including Ghana. See, she also curated the archival records of the James Weldon Johnson branch, that's in Jacksonville, Florida, of the Association of the Study of African American Life and History, where she is the branch historian. Would you please welcome our panel today? What strikes me mostly about this panel is the level of scholarship, the level of work that has gone into a specific area that we're dealing with today. So I'm going to start with something very basic because it underlies everything we're saying here. What is history and whom does it serve? That's a very fundamental question. What is history and whom does it serve? But before we get to that, I want you to think about that a little bit. Before we get to that, each of the remaining members at the panel will give a presentation to sort of establish a point of reference that they think is very important to this discussion. We'll begin with Dr. Jones.
I yield my time to the sisters.
I yield my time back to the brother.
It's on you, Dr. Jones.
No, I'm Leada Grimes, and the thing that I focus on most in my research, which is on black communities in the 19th and early 20th century, particularly, as he said, Rosenwald schools, is their agency, their agenda, and their activism. So many times when we look at black Americans historically, we're looking at them through the lens of oppression. We're looking at them through the lens of slavery, and those were conditions that they endured, but it did not define who they were. And so my focus is on black humanity. And when you focus on black humanity, what you begin to see is that they were people who had their own agendas that stood in contrast to the conditions that they faced. And so I want to focus on, I think we need to be focusing on what was the agenda historically and what is the agenda now.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Takia Anthony. I am also a native of Bowling Green, Kentucky. Graduate of Howard University and North Carolina Central University, so HBCU graduate 3 times. And my point of reference, honestly, similar to what has been produced and what Dr. Grimes has said, it really comes from understanding family history. My great-grandparents are graduates of the Kentucky State University class of 36 and 39. Their children then went to Kentucky State University. I am 4th generation to serve at Kentucky State University, and sitting around listening at Easter and Sunday dinners, going to my great-grandparents' home in Campbellsville on a farm, learning what they said, Booker T. Washington education, but also receiving books and learning the W.E.B. Du Bois education, getting both. I learned about their upbringing. I learned about their time in college. And when I got to school, I would go home and say, Grandma, why don't I see you all in the history books? Where's your story? Why is the civil rights movement centered in Alabama when we had one here in Kentucky? And so that has been my thriving mission, to be a historian. My great-grandfather was a historian, and to follow in his footsteps to be a historian and to enter the women's narrative into history.
Dr. Jones.
To keep it brief, I've now been in Kentucky for 30 years. Came here in 1992 as a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, where again, Dr. Smith served on my doctoral committee in graduate school. But not to be too autobiographical, what I find interesting about Kentucky, what I've always found interesting about Kentucky, are the disparate power dynamics between whites and blacks, but also the fear to talk about it and the acquiescence among the black community relative to the white community in the state. For me, all these conversations really come down to issues of power. Who has the ability to make decisions about the future of any particular group in the space? And so, I guess autobiographically, it is important to note that I grew up in Atlanta, and I'm still there very frequently. I grew up basically in a black world. As a child of the 70s, I don't remember a mayor in Atlanta before Maynard Jackson, who was a Morehouse man like myself. And Atlanta's had a black mayor in that city ever since 1973. That's just speaking politically. All of those mayors have not been good. Some have been bad. One has even gone to prison. And it's important to note that, because what we see in that paradigm, which is an anomaly, is black people have the ability, the luxury to fail, and another black person will get a chance. You don't see that in a lot of other spaces. When you talk about Kentucky, the two major cities, and the other cities, no disrespect to anybody else, they're mostly towns. The two cities in the state really are Louisville and Lexington relative to the experience that I've seen. You've never had a black mayor. It's never even really been close. Daniel Cameron, who is running for governor right now, and while we differ politically, I found it amazing that only one other black person in the history of this state had even attempted to run for governor. And so it kind of runs back to the Carter G. Woodson idea that if you educate or miseducate people properly, in basketball terms, they'll become a self-check. They'll know their place. You know, if they don't have that back door, they'll create one. And so I've been fascinated by the conversations around race here and the lack of conversations around race here and how they move forward, because they really are defined by fear. You know, this is a state that not only either has a zero population growth of black people, but continues to bleed black people. And it's difficult to even have conversations that are just about black people in Kentucky. Because as you define DEI now, which is another brand, a new brand of multiculturalism, you know, this diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, if you say, no, I actually want to talk about anti-black racism specifically right now, there's resistance to that. People that my fraternity brother George Brown and others work with in this state, politicians, are very intentionally, and they'll brand it as anti-CRT, and most of these people can't even have a legitimate conversation about what critical race theory is, but they're pushing laws that make it illegal to substantively teach black history in this state in the public schools from kindergarten through college. And there is no great uproar even in the black community around the state about that. As a father of a 14-year-old child, I find that absolutely terrifying. And if you are a black person who has strong upfront conversations about that, you're branded a revolutionary or a radical or a troublemaker. And the very sad part of it is the state has miseducated enough black people that just like in the past that Dr. Smith went through, you'll have black people who will step up and partner with their white Confederates. And I use that word not in the Civil War context, but very intentionally. They'll partner with their white Confederates to demonize the black person that is really trying to push the state forward. So in closing, I'll say, you know, I used to say Kentucky has to decide what it wants to be. But now I think Kentucky actually has decided what it wants to be. And by every indication, this state has decided, with the majority of the population anyway, that it is very desirous of being a white ethno-state with compliant non-whites in the state that go along to get along with the status quo in place. And I think that is a very true statement. And the question is, what will the future of this state look like as the country and the world becomes more black and brown? And so those are hard questions. They're true questions. They are not meant to offend, but I think they are absolutely necessary to ask.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Smith, would you like to add to your perspective?
I really condensed my comments about researching, writing, and teaching Black history in Kentucky. I've been researching the Black experience in Kentucky for literally over 40 years, and you know, and Dr. Grimes is also one of my former students and has also contributed to the recent volume. So she has a chapter in the book, and so I have watched it evolve from someone who grew up in Lexington, went to Henry Clay High School, and University of Kentucky 3 times over. And you know, my experience has been somewhat opposite from Dr. Jones, because as he came from Atlanta to Kentucky, when I finished my PhD in 1988, I left Kentucky and moved to Memphis. And my PhD is in urban and African American history. So it was a completely different world living in the city of Memphis for 5 years. And while there, co-authored some journal articles on the history of racial violence in the city of Memphis, and just kind of seeing what's going on in Memphis now and kind of knowing the history behind all of that was quite intriguing for me. Now, what I want to say here, and then we'll move forward, is a couple of things. When you asked the question about history, and you know, how do we define history, and of course, you know, the most common, simple way is, you know, we say it's the study of the past and all that, but one of the things that I've learned is that history means different things to different people, at different places, at different times. It's how we define history. And, you know, where people are, you know, focused on critical race theory and 1619 Project and all of that, you know, as a historian, I look at that and don't focus on the arguments for or against, or even how they're defined, you know, however people define it. I look at what led to this discussion. You know, what's behind all of this? What led to how did we get here? So that's one of the things, you know, as a historian, and I've always taught my students, and I still teach my students, especially my undergraduate students. I say, in my class, you're gonna do 2 things. I tell them this first day of class. I say, you're gonna do 2 things in my course. If you don't wanna do these 2 things, you don't need to be in this class. I say, you're gonna think and you're gonna read. You're gonna think and you're gonna read. If you don't wanna think, you don't need to be in here. If you don't want to read, you definitely don't need to be in my class. And so as historians, you know, what we do is that we focus on thinking and reading and writing. But the other thing that history does is that it gives us the opportunity to debate. And so, you know, now when we look at what is going on, you know, we talk about censorship and all of that. You know, I want students to leave college thinking. Not necessarily agreeing. Now, I teach a course on race and sports. I teach a course on the life and legacy of Martin Luther King, Kentucky African American experience, all that. And in my race and sports class, I tell the students, I said, look, when you leave my class, you will never watch another ball game again the same. Whether you agree with what we discuss and all, I'm in your head. Now, what does that mean? That is the fear that some people have in terms of, oh, you're going to indoctrinate the kids. And so this is not about indoctrination, and what I didn't go through in my presentation, I'm going to stop now, is that we've already been indoctrinated. You know, the book that I finished, the way I framed the book, in the introduction and the chapters in the book, I want those who read it to understand how we have already been indoctrinated. So those who are saying, like, this is going to lead to division, this is going to lead to indoctrination, no, we've already been there. In fact, and it's so ironic and appropriate, Senator Neal, that this discussion is taking place in this building because it's in this building that in 1906, the legislature passed the Uncle Tom's Cabin Law, right? And the Uncle Tom's Cabin Law was a law that was passed by the legislature to prevent the showing of the play Uncle Tom's Cabin, because it was the idea that, if people see this play, they see the parade that promotes the play going down the city, then it's going to lead to more racial strife. And so we've got to censor that. We've got to stop that. Anybody that shows the play, any theater manager, whatnot, you're going to be fined, you're going to be in prison, so we cannot show that play. At the same time, when Birth of the Nation was shown, there was no pushback. So kind of going back to what Dr. Jones said in terms of who's in power makes a decision and interprets like, this is fine, this is unacceptable. I mean, it's right here in this building. And it continues to be that way in terms of, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, and how do we define indoctrination?
So, let's drill down on that. The original question I asked is, what is history, and whom does it serve? Dr. Anthony.
Well, we can get into the weeds of, is it a social science, is it a humanities, that question, but who does it serve? History serves everyone. When you look just in short, history, and this is kind of reiterating what Dr. Smith just said, but history, we're looking at past events, people, debates, decisions over the course of space and time. And who does it serve? It serves everyone. What it serves, if I can take it there, what it serves depends on the interpretation. I think, and to insert into this question, as an archivist, we have to look at our sources, where our sources are available, where our sources, or who is collecting and interpreting and producing the sources, how they're preserved. I think all of that is important too.
Well, Dr. Graham, just to follow up on what was just said here, in the broader sense, history serves everyone, correct? But there's something that was said here. Who's collecting it? What's collected? How it's interpreted? What's your perspective on the state of history now, and who does it serve?
So I want to tap into what she said about, what is history. What we're taught in history classes is that history has changed over time. I like to view it as the change in people over time, because a lot of times the history that we read is so highbrow and it's so feels very nebulous and esoteric in nature that is unattainable for most people. And so I would argue that history actually serves those who are able to read it and comprehend it. And I don't think that we've done a great job of producing histories that are available to the masses. The jargon that we use, the language that we use, a lot of times does not serve the general public. My background is in journalism. I was a writer for the Lexington Herald Leader and a paper in New York as well. I've also written for several magazines, like People and Newsweek magazine, and you're taught to write for the average person. And so I think, well, my focus, I should say, is on making sure that history is available to all people, and that it is attainable to the, for the masses. It takes a distinct intellect and a distinct determination to make it through a lot of what's being written.
Well, let me ask you, Dr. Jones, but isn't this a challenge, considering the fact that there's someone's history that's written up in books and adopted and lifted up and become part of the cultural discourse, and then there's the opposite that you might see. So when we start talking about history, where's the challenges in there, particularly as it comes to race?
History's a tool, right? As Dr. Smith pointed out, when you looked at Du Bois and he talked about the ethics of how Americans actually present history and what it becomes agreed upon lies, in effect. and how, so on one hand, whether you talk about something, written for a person with a 7th grade education or somebody with a PhD, history is fixed. I mean, it's real, right? But on the other hand, it's very malleable depending on who's telling that story, okay? And so the power dynamic comes into play there again. And I hate to admit this, but I think that Malcolm X was right when he said that history rewards us most. And I hate to admit it because, my good brother, Dr. Smith, is a historian. And the historians think that they're the most important scholars in higher education. The eyes of political scientists always want to push back against that. But I do think as a social scientist, if you don't have that historical foundation to build upon, then you're kind of lost. But here's the way I frame it, as I have spent my entire adult life, my professional career, and my life dedicated to addressing black suffering and how it can be remedied. And I don't think you get very far until you understand what's happening to you. And that's what scholars like, Du Bois, and journalists like William Monroe Trotter, and Ida B. Wells, and all of these people were really speaking to through the totality of their lives as they addressed black suffering. There are really 3 levels to this, to my thinking, as you talk about anti-black racism and the domination of our white brothers and sisters in the country, because that's what we are. We're in a state of white supremacy, and don't get afraid when I use that, all right? I'm not just talking about these cartoonish depictions of white supremacy where the Ku Klux Klan is burning crosses on your yard, or some white nationalists are screaming, "You will not replace us" in Charlottesville. You see those people coming from a mile away. When I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm talking about any space where our white brothers and sisters think that they and only they, because of the color of their skin, ultimately have the right to think, know, and decide about every major decision that has anything to do with anybody, right? I mean, we still have white brothers and sisters who will come to me as the chair of a Black Studies department at the University of Louisville and tell me what path they think that we should follow to address black suffering. And I'm like, so how is it that you know best? And they've been socialized to a degree where even unconsciously they don't realize it, but they think, because I'm white and we know best about everything. But there are really 3 levels to this when you talk about history, how you establish a culture of domination, and that's what we have in this country, whether you talk about Kentucky or outside of it. 3 levels. 1, the way you establish this domination, imposition. One group forces itself on another group, usually through the use of violence. Look historically, that's happened. When you talk about the slave trade, the international slave trade, that was a forcing of one group because of race upon another group, right? Through the use of violence. But you can't continue to use naked violence all the time to oppress people. That becomes too obvious. Then you get Gabriel Prosser. Then you get Denmark Vesey. Then you get Nat Turner, right? When people don't feel like they have any room to move. So once you do that imposition, then you got to ideologically justify it. And so folks have been justifying the domination of white brothers and sisters in this country for hundreds of years. God made us the people that are supposed to be in control to civilize you. The Noah, Ham, Shem, Japheth story, where there was a curse on black people that we be enslaved because Ham disrespected his father. You see all these ideological justifications of the domination. That, again, is history. And finally, you establish institutions that continue to reaffirm that ideological justification of the original imposition. Educational institutions are just that, right? They reaffirm a history of that domination. So when you put it in that context, anti-CRT legislation isn't about CRT, it's the maintenance of white supremacy in American education so that you can continue to socialize black kids and white kids and others to understand, right, to believe in and to acquiesce to a system of domination that's already in place. That's just real. And so there's a lot of noise around all of that stuff. You can talk to me about an AP African American Studies course all you want to. You can have it if you want to. You can put whatever curriculum in place that you want to in that. And then my question to you is, who gonna teach it? You ain't got very many black teachers at all in this country, and the ones who are in the country, most of them have been educated in a system that reaffirms the white supremacist educational ethics that we're talking about. That's how you get so many black people who will consent to white supremacist realities without even knowing it and will fight against their own harder than they'll fight against their own oppression. So what is history? History is told by the victors, right? That old saying that Dr. Kevin Cosby used last week, if you kill all the lions, the hunter is always going to tell the story, and the hunter is always going to be the hero. So what we're trying to do in Black Studies and in other places, even historians like Dr. Smith outside of Black Studies proper, we're trying to offer correctives to a very imbalanced telling of that story where one group is always the hero. Think about Colin Kaepernick. If you understand that Francis Scott Key was a slaver and a member of the American Colonization Society who wanted to deport all the free black people in this country, and you get past the first verse of that song, the Star Spangled Banner is a racist, pro-slavery song, you wouldn't be upset if another black person never stood up and sang it. That's history.
Well, that raises a conundrum. Because when you utter the words, Black history is American history, to what extent is it? Or how true is that statement? Or is there an exception to the universality of the statement?
No, there's no exception. We've always been here, right? And I shudder to think what America would have been like without black people. One, we built most of the doggone country free of charge. That's one. Two, when you talk about American ideals, white Americans never believed in American ideals. Freedom. You got people writing all men are created equal and the majority of them are slaveholders. How does that work? Justice, equality. Black people have been the ones who always believed in American ideals, not white America. We've always been the ones who've been at the vanguard of that, from that day to this one. So you can't lift us up out of history, not out of American history or out of world history. You want to talk about 1619? Black people weren't dropped on the world stage as slaves in 1619. What was going on with black people before that? Right. We were around. We were building before that. Right. We were establishing civilizations before that, right? But that's never taught. And the lie has been told so long in this country that sometimes the oppression, the deception isn't even intentional anymore. You got white people who believe these agreed upon lies to the point where they think it's truth. That's where you get a Max Wise who works with you.
Well, let's go deeper into the subject matter here, because what you're posing here are the dynamics, or some of the dynamics that are taking place that came from the past manifesting themselves now. So Black history is controversial in the broader society, or some in the broader society. And there's a reaction that's taking place. I think it's implicit in what you're saying, but I'm opening this up to everyone. Just jump in as you please. What is at the heart and the root of this reaction historically and today?
So I think when Carter G. Woodson was putting forth the idea of a Negro Week, which became Black History Month, he said that he wasn't arguing for a history that was simply about black people. He said he was arguing for a history that was without racial bias and without prejudice. And the only reason that you will argue against a history that is without racial bias and without racial prejudice is that you're actually for a white supremacist history. And your goal is to indoctrinate people into that system. If you look back at history and you look at the history of education in this country, if you look at James Anderson's argument about why schools were created, he argues that schools in the early 20th century were part and parcel of the subjugation of black Southerners. The types of education that were endorsed in that hour, in that period, were to bring about the subjugation of black people, to teach you your place in society. And so it goes back to my earlier argument of agenda. What is the agenda of the history that we're teaching? And what is our personal agenda to resist that indoctrination? And I have to go back to what I was saying earlier about making the history accessible, making this knowledge available. I think we as scholars need to be doing the work of not only producing monographs, but also doing the work of writing for publications that are accessible to the masses. How do we break this history down? Dr. Jones just said a lot. But how do we enter the conversation and break that down into small pieces such that the rank and file people, people who just get up and go to work every day, can make use of it? And that's what I think history needs to, where we need to get to with history today.
Part of this discussion as I listen to what you're saying, as I listen to various of the comments that are made here, this relationship between power and what gets to define our reality is inextricably bound together. Is that a correct statement, or anyone expound? Power and the ability to define your reality. What is that relationship to this reaction that we're having now to Black history?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to, that African proverb, until the lions have their historians, the tale of the hunt always glorifies the hunter. And so, with that thought in mind, Dr. Jones mentioned about, white supremacy and all, and for me, the heart of it is where we even are now in terms of what we're dealing with is what we call public memory and collective memory. And, we've seen what's happened with public memory in recent years with the removal of Confederate statues. And, that public memory in the statues, even in the rotunda there, that public memory, of
You're talking about the removal of Jefferson Davis statue.
That public memory was there by way of what was taught in schools. And so for many years, for generations, and so to both Black and white students. And so when you start looking at textbooks in terms of what school kids were reading, K through 12, and what they were not only learning about the period of enslavement or not learning about Reconstruction and civil rights or not learning, it's, when you look at that, it's easy to understand how people think the way they think now. How they have been indoctrinated for so many generations that I think about the number of, when I was, as you know, was very much involved in getting that statue removed out of the rotunda. And at the time, I was chair of the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission. Not long after that, I was politely removed from that assignment. Your services are no longer necessary. But that's fine. They didn't stop me from researching, writing, and teaching Black history. But I thought about that. I thought about how many African American kids, in particular, stood in front of the Jefferson Davis statue and read the pedestal about a patriot, and a hero, because they didn't know, any better. How many Black kids in Western Kentucky, attended school picnics on the grounds of Jefferson Davis Park, not knowing that, wow, here's someone who enslaved my people. I mean, it's, for me, it's like this. I think about, I'm a son and a father and a husband, and I wouldn't stand or dance or have a good time with a song that degrades women. Why would I do that? Why would I stand and enjoy myself on a song that's degrading and doesn't represent, the women who are in my life? So, and I talk more about this in the book in terms of, we mentioned the Star Spangled Banner, but, my old Kentucky home. And, what that has meant, because, in Kentucky, if you have the power, just sort of getting more to your question, you have the power, you can determine myths and truths, and you're in a position to perpetuate certain myths. And, for too long, because of textbooks, we're not familiar, we're not aware of the myths surrounding much of Kentucky history. I teach a course on the history of Kentucky as well. And so getting back to what Dr. Grimes said, in all of my work, I'm mindful that, there are times that I'm writing for an academic audience, But about 20 years ago, I did a pictorial history of blacks in Lexington. And it was about a 128-page book that is still selling. It's unbelievable. But what I wanted to do in that book, I dedicated it to my two daughters at the time. They came out in 2002. And I was able to provide the photographs, the images, while at the same time, include pen portraits of not only the individuals, but also what was taking place. And it was able to capture, the past in photography, which made it even more accessible to the general public, that people may not want to read some of the other things that I'm writing. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't know this. So one of the ways that we make, our experience, accessible to the public is not simply focusing on the national scene, but focusing on rights there, what's happening locally. And so, we did the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia, 8 years ago. I'm not even sure how many school teachers in Kentucky know that our state is the first state that has an encyclopedia on Kentucky African Americans. I spoke to some kids about 3 weeks ago, and I gave them a copy, and the school teachers there, it was a 5th grade class that I was speaking to, and I spoke to 4 different 5th grade classes. And of the 4 classes, there were maybe a total of 5 black students out of those 4 classes. And so I intentionally bought a copy, and I said, hey, I want you all to have this in your library. Because as we go through Black History Month, a lot of school teachers don't know what to teach, which gets us back to not only power, but the pedagogical skills that we're bringing to the classroom. So it's one thing, to have the information to say, okay, we want everybody to teach these books, and here's the content. But, like Dr. Jones says, I'm always concerned about who is prepared and who is qualified, because teaching is not something that you just simply stand up there and do. You've got to, when I think about pedagogical skills, I'm thinking, first of all, you got to be able to communicate, with those in the classroom. And then you've got to be able to evaluate, you've got to make sure there's some application involved. And that's where the thinking and reading comes in. And so, it's one thing to do all of that, but, okay, from a pedagogical standpoint, everybody can't do it. I mean, I've done workshops with school teachers in Kentucky plenty of times. We've taken them to Washington, D.C. We did a civil rights tour of the South one year with a number of, and they were all white teachers from around the state of Kentucky. And, how they simply had no idea where to begin, So, how do we frame the discussion and the content? How do we reach kids from different backgrounds and different ages? In some cases, who, only know 1 or 2 black families in the whole community. There's some parts, even the other parts of Kentucky, where, never had a black teacher, let alone you're going to bring in black content and expect a white teacher to teach it, and they haven't even been around black people, So it's the simple things, like that. So what we do, we just keep on doing what we do. We keep writing and researching and teaching. I think, as I close, one of the major, as I've given more thought to this, and understand this, because I'm a historian, when I see all of this, none of this is new. All this stuff that we're seeing right now, I mean, quite frank, even the response to it is not new. And that
history of banning the books and
no, none of that is new, man. Even John Hope Franklin, I didn't put him up on the screen, who wrote From Slavery to Freedom, first published in 1947 in his 8th edition, which presents the case that American history, or African American history, is American history throughout. Even in 1968, he published a book for 8th grade students. And it was banned. And there was questions of whether or not, it was communist literature. And he had, just references to Crispus Attucks in it, so this is 1968. So, none of it, and it was banned in California.
so we have about 15 minutes left. Please, go ahead.
Right.
I just want to add, when we're looking at power in our response, or the response of what's going on with African American history, taking our power or maintaining our power, our meaning Black African American, We have our institutions to do that. Institutions, whether they be sororities or fraternities, whether they be churches, any other types of groups. Like Dr. Smith said, this is nothing new, and we already have the blueprint. So one thing, a suggestion, Saturday schools, freedom schools, those are something that has already been established that we can tap back into to take power until the powers that be, legislation, whomever, are able to pass bills or do whatever on the civil side. There is work that can be done in the communities that can maintain power or take the power that African Americans have to teach African American history.
What about the concept of speaking truth to power in this situation? That's noted, of course, that's how we survived to this day, right? Well, listen, legislators in 37 states, including Kentucky, have introduced dozens of bills limiting the teaching of issues related to race or racism. That's exercise of power. How do we deal with that?
Well, one of the things, I mean, we do is that, things what you're doing right now, in terms of these kind of panel discussions and programs, not simply for the month of February. We focus on, I mean, it's the end of the month. A lot of folk have done with Black History Month already. It's like it's February, okay, that's over with. First week is fine, but now we're moving into March and we're moving into Women's History Month. And we're moving in Colon Cancer Awareness Month. And every month we've got different things that are important and that we should focus on. But, you shouldn't focus simply on colorectal cancer during the month of March, right? It should be something that is on our minds, the entire year. Especially when you get to a certain age. We shouldn't just focus on women's history during the month of March, all through 365, which is the same with African American History Month. So, we have to, constantly continue to organize. I think, Dr. Grimes, she's been involved with the making of a film in Western Kentucky, because she's a film writer as well. And so, there's something that I think that people are missing, is that the difference between now and then, when I say now and then, in 1906 with Uncle Tom's Cabin Law, and then now in 2023 and what we see this effort of indoctrination, is that in 1906 they didn't have social media. They didn't have historical documentaries. We do. There's no way you're going to be able to shield this generation from access to information. You can do all you can ban all the books you want to, but it's on. And history, at the root word, the Greek root word of history is inquiry. And we know that people want to know, and they have inquiring minds want to know, and they want to know because no matter how we try to avoid race, is so much a part of our contemporary society. It comes up even in the most innocent way. Just a couple of weeks ago, the focus on the Super Bowl. It's like, wow, this is the first time in the history of the Super Bowl we've had 2 black quarterbacks. Okay, so why is that the case? So somebody tell me, I'm not getting in a book, but somebody's got to explain to me, why are we still talking about the first black this, the first black that? Why are we still talking about violence, police violence? Why are we still talking about generational wealth? Why, when I live in my neighborhood, that I say, okay, the black people live on this side of the town and the white people live on this side of town, where does all that come from? And so, young people want to know, man, and, you can't, you can banish all the books you want to. The last thing I'll say is that what's also dawned on me is that I believe, and I could be, and I got to think about this a little bit more, so I'm just throwing this out there. I believe that it's not so much concerned about black people in these courses. It's concerned about white students taking these courses. Because in my experience, I have more white students in my race and sports, in Kentucky African American history, and life and legacy of Martin Luther King and all that, than I have African American students. I have few African American students in those courses. And what's happened is that we saw with the killing of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, we saw more multi-generational people out there protesting, right? Which tells me that while they're taking these classes and they're learning and they've had these inquiring minds, and so now that generation is saying, hey, you know, we've been taught all these lies for years. Why didn't somebody bring this to my attention beforehand? And it's like, okay, now we got to keep these books. It's not so much keeping the books out of the hands of black people, because in the 1930s and 40s, they say, hey, y'all go ahead and read Carter G. Woodson all you want to. But now, you know, you see it differently.
Dr. Grimes, I believe you were going to make a comment earlier.
I was just gonna say, we're talking about, you know, how history has been taught, how it can be taught, and, you know, I just wanna make sure that we understand that this is not just our work. We all are, black, scholars here, but it's not just our work to do in the classroom, it's not just our work to do in the community. It's really the responsibility of anyone who is interested in us truly living up to the ideas, of freedom and justice for everybody. I don't think there's any real, you know, things such as, you know, a lot of times we might look at something, we say, oh, that's a black movie. But what might it teach you about black life? I don't get the luxury of existing as a black woman in America and only reading black history. I have to understand American history. And I would challenge every American to understand that black history is American history, and so that you should be engaged in that work as well. So that you should be picking up books when you see a black face on it and trying to understand what that is. You should see movies that have all black cast members, sitcoms that have all black cast members, histories written about black life, so that you're informed and you're also doing the work. Otherwise, we will sit here next year and we'll have a very similar conversation and not a lot will have been done. I also want to challenge us to seek out different stories. So yes, slavery was a very real era in black history. But there are also people within that era who were fighting for their freedom, and they achieved that freedom. And so I want to, you know, mention people like William Wells Brown, who was writing and publishing about abolition. And at that moment, he was writing, you know, along with Frederick Douglass about the same issue. And William Wells Brown is a Kentuckian. Why don't we know his story? Why don't we know who Charlotte Dupay is, who was an enslaved woman by Henry Clay? But when she went to Washington with him while he was serving there, she sued for her freedom. Those are the stories that we need to bring out and be talking more about. Because even though a lot of those people were enslaved, their minds were free. And that's been a general theme here today, I think, is, you know, this idea of indoctrination. We all need to figure out how we've been indoctrinated with certain lies about our history and figure out how we're going to move forward with the truth.
So we have only a few minutes left. I want to ask each of you to address or give us a sobering and or a hopeful message with respect to the subject matter we're dealing with today. If you self-limit 2 minutes perhaps, in any order.
So I think that was my message. I want to invite all of us to engage in this work. And I want us each to understand and know that it is available and accessible to each of us. And we need to be also doing the work of writing in such a way that it's accessible to people who only read newspapers. We could be producing columns and sharing this historical knowledge. Documentaries, as Dr. Smith said, I worked on a documentary and it's called Invented Before You Were Born. And it tells the story of a slaveholder down in Western Kentucky who freed over 65 slaves, and they built 3 free black communities down in Russellville, Kentucky, Upper Bibbtown, Lower Bibbtown, and Russellville's Black Bottom. The film talks about not only the slaveholder and those freed people, but the descendants of those freed people who have come back together to deal with what that story means to their lives and how they move forward. Lots of ways we can engage in this history, and I just challenge each one of us to find our place and begin to act.
I would have to reiterate, looking at the rank and file and the masses, I think it's super important that we understand and start with our family histories and then expand out, right? Looking and doing a lot of oral histories with the oldest members of our families or our communities. That's an assignment that I give to all of my students at the end, and these are my students here, and they've all done those projects. Interviewing the oldest person in their family or in their community, at their church, at their mosque, wherever, and to understand, and from there looking at the secondary resources, coming down to SESCA, which is our archive at Kentucky State, doing archival research, and from there building on, because everything isn't just middle-class history. And if that's the only thing that gets put into the history book, then a whole group of people get left out. And so I think it starts with our family history, and that's just a conversation that on Sunday nights or Sunday evenings while we're cooking, or while we're, after the football games, you mentioned, the Super Bowl, after the football game to talk and to ask those questions. Well, why is it important that we're still talking about having a black quarterback? If that was the question in my family, then it would be because your grandfather could not be a quarterback after being the undefeated champion in 1957 at Florida A&M. And when he got drafted to the NFL, had to switch his position because he was told that black people can't lead a team, they can't be leaders, they're not smart enough to play quarterback. And so that's a real family conversation. And so if we start talking to one another, those histories do come out, those stories do come out. There's some context and there's some perspective that's put there, and then maybe then people are able to then do some additional research, and the books and the articles that we're writing will then help. So start with your family, start with your local histories.
Dr. Jones.
I am not as hopeful as I've aged, kind of in the vein of Henry McNeil Turner and, Haj Malik El-Shabazz, even Martin Luther King Jr. as he aged, and Du Bois left the country ropes and lost hope. I'm not as hopeful as some people are in where we are and where we're going. I know in the black community in particular, there's kind of this ecclesiastical mandate, coming from the tradition of black preachers to make everybody feel like everything is gonna be all right. I don't think everything is all right. I don't know if it's gonna be all right if we stay on the course that we're on. I think Dr. Smith is right. It's good to try to have sessions like this, not just during February, but throughout the year. But you look around the room, it's barely half full. And if not for sister students, it would even be less full. There's an interest. We've been at other things. We were just at something a few days ago together. Same type of population turnout among black people and white people. So there seems to be somewhat of a disinterest in even having conversations around this, not just in white America, but black America as well. I'm a professor myself. I think sister's right. We try to diversify the knowledge. That's why I write a bi-weekly column for that same Courier Journal. Been doing so for years. I don't know how many people read it. I get email from folks who hate me because I always write about black folk, and you're not supposed to do that. But, I'm just not sure.
I read it.
I know you do, but, and this is an example even at the college level where we hope that we have the best and the brightest of our children. They've been so mis-socialized. This is one example. A young black student told one of my students last semester, a black female student, who was taking an Asian studies class, and let me say this slowly so you can digest it. A student who was taking an Asian studies class, and my student was talking to her about the black studies class that she was in, and this young black student said, "Why take black studies? That's a waste of time." A black student said this. And so we see these examples, not just on the national level with the mentality of a Clarence Thomas, or a Condoleezza Rice, but on the state level with the mentality of a Daniel Cameron, who I tried to teach as an undergraduate, didn't listen to me. Nobody really wants to talk about that, and we see that repeated again and again and again. And so, and I'll close with this, I'm very, very clear about what white supremacy is. I'm very, very clear that it's rooted in power. I'm also very, very clear that the supplications that we make to white America are in effect irrational as black people. Because what we're doing is asking a power structure that has been established over centuries through the use of violence, through the use of oppression, through the use of miseducation, very intentionally, to establish that power base, to then just give it away. To give it away, to strip themselves and their children of that power for the benefit of us and our children. And so the question is, the reality is, I don't think that the majority or even a decent percentage of white America is gonna wanna see an all-black movie, or read books about black characters, or change curricula in public schools or private or independent schools to reflect anything about black people. So my question is, what is black America willing to do about it? And I think we're in a dangerous time where even the well-educated, best-prepared black people in this country, an all too troubling percentage of them are much more concerned about vulgar individual careerism and individual positions than they are about collective power. And until we deal with that reality and not just march and pray and sing and say everything's gonna be all right in the by and by, and I believe in God. But a former governor, Matt Bevin, came to Louisville and said, I can tell you what to do about black violence in the city.
Pray.
Pray. And if prayer really changed power dynamics like that, as dedicated to God and prayer as black people are, we'd be ruling the world. So the question is, what are we gonna do about it?
And we'll end with Dr. Smith.
Oh, there's so much for me to unpack as a pastor and as a professor. And I have known this young man literally since he was a young man.
He had, and I loved him.
And I've had very frank conversations with him. But let me close on this, because I know we're short. I am optimistic.
God bless you.
And the reason, and I'm gonna tell you the reason, because I don't believe my work is in vain. If I was pessimistic, I would stop researching, writing, and teaching now. But the story's got to be told.
Right.
And we can't say, no, I'm done. I'm closing up my book, I'm going home. I still hold on to the words of Frederick Douglass, who said, and I close, our destiny is largely in our own hands. If we survive, we'll have to seek. If we succeed in the race of life, it must be by our own energies and our own exertions. Others may clear the road, but we must go forward or be left behind in the race of life. I close on that.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ricky Jones, Dr. Takia Anthony, Dr. Gerald Smith, and Dr. Leadetta Grimes. Give them a round of applause. Thank you for being here, and you scholars, thank you for those insights. I'm sure they're going to be beneficial to those who toil in the garden, trying to turn the soil to make a better crop. I'm talking about a crop that satisfies and serves black folks and folks of goodwill in this country and beyond. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
You know, I'm a history teacher, or was a history teacher. I'm retired now. But I used to tell my kids when we started the class at the beginning of the year, if you don't know where you've been, you won't know where you're going. And that is the truth. We have to continue to educate and to continue to research. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for being here today. What a display of knowledge and intellect here and the insight. And thank you to these scholars that were here today, Dr. Smith, Dr. Grimes, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Anthony. Let's give them a warm round of applause again. Thank you for providing this most powerful information today. And thank all of you for being here today. Your attendance and participation is part of the history making here today. And Black history is indeed American history. Learning and knowing our history is the key to building bonds of respect and trust that leads to understanding. And this first collaboration between Kentucky Black Legislative Caucus, the Kentucky Historical Society, and the African American Initiative surely will not be our last. And again, thank you all. God bless you, God keep you, and have safe travels on your return home.